this is Michaela from Team Retroarch, where we like retro games, we like roguelikes, and we like the devices that bring them to us. So I find that a lot of my videos on retro gaming devices seem to be inspired by either participation in Reddit communities or Reddit posts I make myself. Well, recently, I actually took out my OG Wedge 2DS and started playing my Nuzlocke of Pokemon Platinum on it. And I had completely forgotten how much I love the look and feel of the OG 2DS. I realized that I loved it so much that I decided to post a picture of it to the R3DS community on Reddit. And while discussing with the community the benefits of the wedge-shaped 2DS over the clamshell, bigger 2DS XL, I started to realize that the real potential of this device comes from installing custom firmware and homebrew applications. Then you actually unlock a lot of things that this device couldn't do before, such as the ability to inject NES, Game Boy Advance games, and utilize native DS game compatibility through third-party applications like TWilight menu. Now, it's been quite a while since I put custom firmware on this 2DS, and I honestly don't remember how I did it, so I actually have been in the market for a black-facing front 2DS for a while, so I just went ahead and grabbed one on GameStop. And apparently, I got one of the last ones, so I'm gonna wait until it gets here, hope that it's in decent condition, and then I'm gonna do a video on how to actually put custom firmware on a 2DS system. So here's what this video is going to cover. We're going to showcase native Virtual Console emulation on a 2DS. We're going to also show off native DS emulation, both using TWilight menu and using an official game cart. And we're going to test out Retroarch on this device to see if it is a feasible way to emulate older systems on a 2DS. And ultimately, the reason for covering this is to see if it's actually worth picking up a 2DS in 2021 to use as an emulation or a retro gaming device over something like the RGB10 Max or the RG351P. So let's dive in, let's get started, and let's see what we're working with. Now, the 2DS and 3DS systems have native Virtual Console support officially for a set amount of games for Game Boy Color, and Nintendo. Now, original 3DS and 2DS models did not have support for Super Nintendo Virtual Console emulation, but the new 3DS XL and the new 2DS XL do, because there is a better processor in those systems. Now, once you have custom firmware installed, you are not limited to just the games that were released by Nintendo for Virtual Console. You can actually inject your own ROMs, and I'll be making a separate video shortly on how to do that. Now, there are some limitations to native Virtual Console. You are limited to just the one black and white color palette on Game Boy. You can't change to the green DMG look or any other look. And you are also limited to only one save state per game. Now, something that is not commonly known about the Nintendo 3DS and 2DS systems is they actually have native GBA Virtual Console capability, but Nintendo, for some reason, decided not to utilize it except for one game, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap, that they gave out for Nintendo 3DS ambassadors. However, with custom firmware and the right tools, we can inject our own Game Boy Advance ROMs. Now, one thing to note here is that there is no save state support using this method. If you go to hit the bottom screen, you're just going to get a notification not to put the system into sleep mode until you've closed out of a Game Boy game. Now, Nintendo DS is natively compatible and supported on this device, and you can actually boot up DS ROMs with custom firmware using a third-party application called TWilight Menu++. And once you boot into it, you are going to be presented with a DSi style menu with a list of all of your ROMs. Now, this does require a little bit of setup, which I will show you in a future video. But for today, I just wanted to show you that the functionality is there, and once you boot into a DS game, the Nintendo 2DS will treat it as though it were a 2DS game plugged into the cart, and it will run natively with no problems. So here's Kirby Superstar Ultra running through TWilight menu, and you could see we're running at full speed. And this is really one of the ways in which a game like this was meant to be played. There are plenty of single board computers that can emulate Nintendo DS perfectly, but a lot of them lack touch screens. And here you have that native vertical top screen, bottom screen. You have the stylus if you want to utilize it. And while there might be better screens out there, like with the Powkiddy RGB 10 Max, sometimes nothing beats playing a game the way the developer intended. And in the case of Nintendo DS, a 2DS wedge just feels so comfortable to hold that these games become really enjoyable in long play sessions. And of course, because the 3DS and 2DS natively support DS cartridges, you can just use your official carts if you have them, or if you are collecting them. And look at that, playing an official Nintendo DS cartridge on an official Nintendo 2DS runs at full speed. What a novel idea. Now, some people don't like the upscaling that happens when you play a Nintendo 2DS game on a 3DS, and if you don't like it and you want the native resolution, I believe you can hold the select button while booting the game, and that will fix the problem if it is something that bothers you. Personally, it doesn't bother me, and just know that you are going to have black borders around the screen if you decide to do that. Now, we would be remiss in talking about a Nintendo 2DS as a retro gaming device if we didn't mention Retroarch. Now, Retroarch is available on several consoles and devices, and if we scroll down on the website, it does mention 3DS and 2DS as one of the devices. However, it specifically shows the new logo, which means that if we try to install this on an older 3DS or 2DS, we are probably going to run into issues, but we're going to download the CIA and we're going to try it anyways. And installing Retroarch is easy. We're going to right-click the 7-zip, and we're just going to extract right to the Downloads folder. And in this folder is the CIA install file, as well as the Retroarch assets. So we're going to move these files to the SD card. Let's start with the Retroarch folder. You could just move that right to the root of the SD card. And then drag the CIA folder to the CIA's folder in your SD card. If you don't have it, you could just make one. Now, if you already have custom firmware installed on your 3DS or 2DS, you'll use this program called FBI, and this is how we're going to install Retroarch. We're going to go into the SD, and we're going to go into that CIA's folder, and then we're simply going to click Install and Delete CIA. And then just go ahead and let it install. It won't take very long. Now, right off the bat, Retroarch took a long time to boot up on this model, and there was all this logs and text at the bottom screen that I just didn't really care for, and I couldn't figure out how to shut that off. and it remained persistent throughout my experience with RetroArch and kind of started off my experimentation on a sour note. But here we are, it looks like RetroArch, it has some cores already pre-installed, so let's give it a shot. Here is Super Mario Advance 2 for the Game Boy Advance running under the GPSP core, and we're getting a lot of audio slowdown here. If you look at the bottom of the screen, as much as I don't like having that persistent text on the bottom, we are getting a frame rate reading, and we're dipping down to 40, 30 frames per second, and the audio is stuttery, and to me, this is just unplayable, which is very disappointing considering if you were to put the same game into a GBA Virtual Console injection, it would run at full speed. Now, one of the things I really like about using RetroArch is using the MGBA core to play Super Game Boy enhanced games and actually get those customized color palettes without having to actually own a Super Nintendo and a Super Game Boy. And we do still get that feature here playing RetroArch on a 2DS with Kirby's Dream Land 2. However, we're still getting a lot of slowdown, and we are still getting some audio and some frame rate dips. And it's not nearly as bad as with Game Boy Advance, but it still happens from time to time, and it's enough to get annoying. Especially considering if we play the same game using the native Virtual Console injection, we lose those color palettes and we lose the extra functionality of RetroArch, but the game plays at full speed. It would be really nice to have the best of both worlds on this specific model of 2DS, but for the moment it doesn't seem possible. However, I'm going to keep researching and seeing if we can get some Super Game Boy color palettes in here. I did try to run some arcade emulation with a CPS1 game, Street Fighter 2, but unfortunately the 2DS just hung and then eventually crashed. So I'm guessing arcade emulation is not going to happen on this device. Even NES emulation struggled with this system. Here's Super Mario Bros. 3, and NES is usually a very easy system to emulate, but here on the 2DS with RetroArch, we've got severe audio lag and frame dips. And this is very unplayable here in RetroArch, but again, if you were to go to the native Virtual Console injection, you'll be playing this game at full speed. So RetroArch on the 2DS just doesn't seem worth it. I didn't even test SNES emulation because if it's struggling with Game Boy and NES, SNES is just not gonna work. Another annoying thing that RetroArch did on the 2DS is as I was using the cores, it automatically started adding them to the home screen, and I really didn't like that. I just wanted the one RetroArch logo. So I ultimately ended up just deleting RetroArch from my 2DS. There may be some promise with some standalone emulators, so I'm going to look into that and report back. So ultimately, why would you want a 2DS wedge in 2021 when there are so many better devices out there? Well, here are some potential reasons. One, you might actually like the form factor. This is actually a very comfortable system to hold for an extended period of time, especially if you have smaller hands. Two, you may just want native DS and 3DS support, and you don't necessarily want to spend the extra money for the bigger screens, the 3D, or the clamshell form factor of a 3DS, a new 3DS, or a new 2DS XL. And finally, you really want to just play Nintendo DS and 3DS games natively, but you also want the Virtual Console inject support that comes with having custom firmware. And at this point, you're really just getting the device to play 3DS and Nintendo DS games, and anything else that you get to play on this device would be a bonus. And you will get native support for NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance on this system, which covers a lot of retro gaming. And that'll do it for this video. I am actually really looking forward to really diving into what a modded Brick Wedge 2DS can do in 2021. Thank you so much for watching, and if this video was helpful to you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.